Hello everyone, this is Jason from STEM Nerds. Thank you so much for being here today. We are going to be covering a little bit of general chemistry, just enough chemistry so that we can understand biology. If you're looking for hardcore chemistry, that may come later, but it's not this video. This video is kind of an introduction to general chemistry. Hope you enjoy it. Thanks for being here. Well, I figured let's go ahead and start out with this scary looking thing. This is called the periodic table. And you can see we've got all these elements here that make up all of what we know to exist. But there's a few things I want to point out. In this video, our main focus is on biologically relevant elements. And some of the things I'm going to say here in some ways get undone when you take a general chemistry course because the focus is completely different. Here, the vast majority of the elements that we're talking about are right there. You see that says HONC, H-O-N-C. 99% of what makes up living things is hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon. And so because we're relying mostly on those four elements and a few others, we're going to be staying mostly at the top part of the periodic table. So let's take a look at the general structure of an element, of an atom. And so there's a few things that we need to know. Thing number one is in the center, what's called the nucleus. We have protons and neutrons. And those protons and neutrons, they have mass. And so the protons are positively charged and the neutrons don't have a charge. But again, those are right in the center. And here, the protons are designated with that plus. The neutrons are the red circles. And then you're going to see orbiting around the nucleus, kind of like planets around the sun, you have electrons, and those are negatively charged. And for the most part, they don't contribute in any real meaningful way to the mass of an element, but it's the protons and neutrons that do. Now, one of the things that you should understand for the biologically relevant elements that we're talking about, the vast majority of them, when they're in the ground state, in their normal state, the number of protons is going to be equal to the number of electrons, which will be equal to the number of neutrons. And so, for instance, in this picture right here, what we're looking at is carbon. Carbon has 6 protons. If you count the little blue circles, you'll see that. It has 6 neutrons. That's the red circles. And then it has 6 electrons. And again, that is all balanced. Now, for each element, it has an atomic mass and an atomic number. The atomic mass or mass number that's represented by A here equals the number of protons and the number of neutrons that an element contains. The atomic number, represented here by Z, is the number of protons, and X is the actual element. So let me show you this. Let's go back to our periodic table real fast. And so we come back here, and let's go ahead and let's travel over to the right-hand side, and you're going to see the letter C up there. It's in the light blue. That's carbon. And you're going to see that carbon, it's got that number 6 up there in the upper left-hand corner of that blue box. That number is the atomic number. What it's saying is that carbon has 6 protons. Now, if you look underneath carbon right there, there's a number 12. Why? Because if we go back here, what we just said is that this is carbon. Carbon has 6 protons, 6 neutrons, 6 plus 6. That gives us the 12. And some change here because we've got something else going on there. I'll explain in a minute. But it's roughly 12. That is the atomic mass. Now, here's something that's really important to understand. Are you ready? That number, the atomic number, so carbon's atomic number was 6. It's 6 because of the number of protons. And so as it turns out, the number of protons, because it equals the atomic number, that's the reason why we call carbon carbon, because it has 6 protons, therefore it has the atomic number of 6. If we were to add protons, we change the element, and that's the important thing to understand. It's the number of protons that defines what we call the element. So if we stay in the periodic table and we look at carbon, and we go 1 to the right, we add a proton. Look at that. We have 7 protons. If we've now changed the name of the element, it is now nitrogen. We add another one, we go 8 protons, and look what we have here. We have oxygen. So again, it's the number of protons that are that's defining the atomic number and defining what we call the element. So now that we know that, the atomic mass, represented here by letter A, is protons plus neutrons. Atomic number is just the number of protons. Now I wanted to show you something else when it comes to the structure of an atom. So I showed you carbon previously. Now I have a different element here. We've got 8 protons, 8 neutrons, and 8 electrons. Now something you're going to notice is the electrons look a little bit different. So let me show you something here. Let me go back to carbon. And you're going to see with carbon, we had 6 protons, 6 neutrons, 6 electrons. But what I want to focus on here is the way the electrons look as they're orbiting the nucleus. And so one of the things that we have to understand, again, we're going to focus here on biologically relevant elements. And in this particular case, what we can say is that we have 2 electrons in an inner orbital. And the minute we go over 2, we have a second orbital. And for carbon, we can see that we have 4 electrons here. That second orbital, in this particular case, is the outermost orbital. We call that the valence shell. And that valence shell can hold up to 8 electrons. Okay, so we have the electrons orbiting the nucleus. We can have 2 in the first orbital. We can have 8 in the next one. And for the biologically relevant elements, we're going to say that they hold to what's known as an octet rule. An octet rule means that we can have up to 8 electrons in an orbital after the first one. And once we go beyond that, we have to start adding. Now, please, if you take chemistry, we get further down that periodic table, things are going to change. But for us in biology, that rule is generally going to hold true. So let's come back here. This is water. And now we have our 8 protons, we have our 8 neutrons, and we have 8 electrons. But I want you to pay attention to what has happened. That outermost orbital, again, it can hold up to 8 electrons, but the important thing here is remember in the previous one we had 4 electrons and they were all on different parts of the orbital. But the minute we start adding more, they begin to pair up, and this is super important. And the reason why it's important is you can see the paired up electrons at the top and the paired up electrons on the right-hand side. You're going to see individual electrons on the left-hand side and at the bottom. The reason this is so important, it's the individual electrons, the unpaired electrons that can form bonds. And bonds help an element, an atom, become stable because ultimately that outer orbital really does want 8 electrons out there to remain stable. And so those individual electrons will often form bonds with other elements so that they both have a complete valence shell. So let me show you what that looks like. We've got a few examples here. We have hydrogen, and hydrogen has a proton and it has an electron. So it's only got 1 proton in the center, it's got 1 electron. They're matching. We have helium. They're not showing the protons in the nucleus right now, but it has 2 protons, 2 electrons. Now here's the thing. Because it is only in that first orbital, that is a complete shell. Then we go down a row here, and we can see lithium and carbon and fluorine and neon. But what we're seeing here, and the important thing I need you to recognize, is the little blue dots represent electrons. And the way those electrons are paired up is vital to the stability of that element. So we can see here things like fluorine, chlorine beneath. There is just 1 individual electron that needs to pair up with something. And because of that, those particular elements really want to pair up. Now you're going to see things like neon, and earlier we talked about helium. Their outer shell is complete, right? It's got if it's neon, the Ne, it's got 8 electrons in that outer shell. All 4 are paired up. If we added another one, I have to add another shell, another orbital. But with this particular case, what's nice is this is a very stable element because, well, it doesn't need any electrons. It's self-contained. Okay, now, turns out, let me show you the next picture here. This one's really important because this shows us that elements can form different types of bonds, and these bonds are super important, again, for the stability of the element and eventually the compound once these bonds form. And so I'm going to do this a little bit out of order. I want to start with the upper right-hand side where we see covalent bonds. And there's actually 2 different types of covalent bonds. Now remember what I said here. We are really focused on biological systems in an aqueous solution. So I'm going to give you some bond strengths here, but we're narrowly focused. If we were to look at bond strengths really in light of just chemical reactions, especially outside of an aqueous solution, these bond strengths, they change. So in a biological system, i.e. a cell, The nonpolar bonds tend to be the strongest inside of a cell. And the reason for that, and something that you really need to know, is the reason the nonpolar covalent bonds are so strong is the electrons between two elements are being shared equally. And so a really great example here is oxygen, O2. It's actually sharing a couple different electrons. And because of that equal sharing of electrons, you have the same elements sharing electrons, you have a very, very strong bond in an aqueous solution. And so nonpolar covalent bonds are going to be our strongest bond. Again, very narrowly focused here. If you take chemistry, this is going to change, I promise you. So don't carry this into chemistry. It's going to be different. Next strongest bond for us is going to be the polar covalent bond, and that is the bond directly underneath where it says nonpolar. You've got the water. And so when we talked about that earlier, we talked about oxygen having those two free electrons. And we also said, hey, hydrogen only has one electron in its outer orbital. Well, look what happens. This is why water forms, because oxygen can form bonds with two hydrogens, and we get water. And that is a polar covalent bond. And polar covalent bonds, because it's covalent, are still very strong. But because in this particular case, it's a polar covalent bond, the electrons are not necessarily being shared equally. The electrons are a little bit closer to the oxygen than they are the hydrogen. This picture doesn't show that very well, but in a polar covalent bond, the electrons are closer to the more electronegative element. In other words, the element that has more protons in the nucleus. And so while there's a sharing there, it's an unequal sharing of electrons. Still a strong bond, not quite as strong as a nonpolar covalent bond in an aqueous solution. Okay, next one. We're going to go back to the left here. We're going to look at the ionic bond. Now, the ionic bond is a little bit different. So in the covalent bonds, we had a sharing. With ionic bonds, things are not being shared anymore. What we have is an element taking an electron from another element, and then we have an opposite in charge. And whenever you have an opposite charge, a positive and a negative, those opposite charges attract. And so one of the most common examples of an ionic bond is sodium and chloride to form sodium chloride. Sodium has one electron in its valence shell, its outermost shell. Chlorine has 7. So this is going to work out great. Chlorine, very electronegative. It's got a lot of protons in its nucleus, so it's got a strong attraction to the negatively charged electrons. It basically just takes the electron away from the sodium. What's keeping those two together is the fact that now sodium has taken on a full positive charge. It's -1 electron. And the chlorine has taken on a full negative charge. It's +1 in the electron side. And so that charge is keeping them together. Now, that bond in an aqueous solution is weaker than either of the types of covalent bonds we've already talked about. And if we think about this, just what we already know in everyday life, if you were to take sodium chloride, salt, put it in water, what happens? It magically vanishes. It goes away. We say it dissolved. Well, what happened? Those bonds in the sodium chloride have easily broken. So we have nonpolar, polar, ionic would be the next, again, in our very restricted environment. And then finally, we have hydrogen bonds in the lower right-hand corner. I'm not really going to talk about the metallic bonds because for our purposes, it's not vital. But for the hydrogen bonds, that's also really important. And that is by far the weakest type of bond in the environment that we're talking about, because what's happening with a hydrogen bond is we have what's known as a dipole. So you see that little delta symbol on that picture in the lower right-hand corner? It kind of looks like a funny-looking D. What that means is we've got two water molecules. And remember what I said earlier, right above we said, hey, we've got oxygen, we've got two hydrogens, and while it's a nonpolar bond and they are sharing electrons, the electrons are being shared unequally. Well, that sets up something called a dipole. A dipole is when you have a compound that is not sharing electrons easily, and because of that, you have a charge distribution in that one compound. And so for the water, or in the molecule, so for the water, that oxygen takes on a slightly negative charge because the electrons are closer to it. And the hydrogens take on a slight positive charge because the electron is further away from the hydrogens. And so now you have this charge distribution within that water molecule. And guess what? If you have a second water molecule like we're seeing here, opposite charges attract. And so the hydrogens of that second water molecule that are slightly positively charged are going to be attracted to the slightly negative charge of an oxygen of a different water molecule. And that's a hydrogen bond. And so really the hydrogen bonds are, in fact, due to the fact that the molecule of water has polar covalent bonds. And again, for our purposes, hydrogen bonds extraordinarily weak. Even at room temperature in an aqueous solution, they're constantly breaking and reforming, far weaker than the ionic, and certainly much weaker than either types of covalent bond. Now, I alluded to this already a little bit, but there are different types of bonds, and these are types of covalent bonds. What we can see here, you can have single bonds, double or triple bonds. The single bond, we've already mentioned water a couple of times, and so this is a nice depiction of how hydrogen and water are sharing electrons on the left-hand side. You can have double bonds like you do in carbon dioxide. When you have those double bonds, the elements tend to be a little bit closer to one another, and by the time you get the triple bonds, those elements are very, very close to one another. And so, again, the point here is that you can have single, double, or even triple bonded molecules depending on the elements involved. Now, remember when I said for the biologically relevant elements, for the most part, the number of protons equals the number of neutrons, which equals the number of electrons. But that's not always the case. Sometimes the number of protons and the number of electrons can differ. And so what we see here on the left-hand side, you have a neutral atom. Again, it's what we've been talking about since the start of this video. Protons equal neutrons equal electrons. But if we move to the middle, we can see that we've labeled this a cation. Well, what's different? We have one less electron. And so what happens here is we have an element that has taken on a positive charge. And so whenever you see a cation, it's a positively charged element where the number of protons is greater than the number of electrons. We would say this is a +1, all right, because we have one more proton than we do electron. Now, if we had an additional proton in here, it would be +2. The anion on the right-hand side, that is a negatively charged element because we can see that we have one more electron than we do proton. So we have 5 electrons, we have 4 protons. So that would be actually technically a -1. If we added a second electron or took a proton away, it would be -2. And so here, the main point is whenever you see an ion, if you see an ion, we have a difference between the protons and the electrons. Cations are positively charged, anions are negatively charged. The other thing that can happen is we can have what's known as an isotope. So isotopes are a little bit different. Let's start on the left-hand side. This is something we are already used to. We've seen carbon. We know that carbon has an atomic mass of 12. That's because it has 6 protons and 6 neutrons, something we talked about earlier in the video. This is a very stable element. This is the element in its ground state. It's by far the most common. Everything is equal, 6 electrons, 6 protons, 6 neutrons. But then when you have an isotope, you're changing the number of neutrons. Remember, we cannot change the protons. If we change the protons, we change the element. But in carbon-13 and then carbon-14, look what has changed. It's just the number of neutrons. And so if you ever see that word isotope, what we're dealing with is an element that has an additional neutron or possibly more than one neutron. Now, when we get to carbon-14, some of you might have heard of carbon-14 dating. What we have here is an isotope that is radioactive, and it will break down. It doesn't necessarily break down into carbon-12. It actually breaks down into nitrogen. But the point here is that sometimes when you have an isotope, these isotopes can be unstable, and they may break down in a matter of seconds, minutes, hours, or maybe even hundreds, if not thousands of years to break down some of these isotopes. So an isotope, once again, is an element that has additional neutrons. Okay, so we defined some key terms. We know how an element is structured. We know we have protons and neutrons in the nucleus. We have electrons orbiting. We know that we can have 2 electrons in the first orbital, up to 8 in the second orbital. We know that in order for an element to be stable, it really needs 8 electrons in that valence shell. And sometimes the element forms bonds to get there. We know that those bonds are based on the number of free electrons, individual electrons, because paired electrons are very stable. We know that the protons are going to equal the number of neutrons, which are going to equal the number of electrons in the ground state for the biologically relevant elements. We also hopefully understand that these elements, when they form bonds, they can be either nonpolar, which is in our case is the strongest, then polar, ionic, and then hydrogen, again in a very, very narrow environment that we're talking about in a biological system in an aqueous solution. Again, don't take that into chemistry. They're going to change it for you, and rightfully so. We also know that we can have single, double, or triple bonds. Now, what we're going to be doing in the next video is we actually have to talk about, okay, well, how are we starting to put all this together so that we can understand biology a little bit easier. So we're going to be talking about things like pH. And in the next video or a couple of videos from now, we're going to be talking about molecules like macromolecules, large molecules like carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So that was a very brief, hopefully brief understanding of some general chemistry. As always, thank you so much for being here. Have a great week, everyone.